Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome back to the Wade Center Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade, here with co-host and producer Aaron Hill. And we've got a very special guest for our Thanksgiving episode. It's Tish Harrison Warren. Welcome, Tish.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, Warren is the author of several books, including Liturgy of the Ordinary, Sacred Practices in Everyday Life, and Prayer in the Night for those who work or watch or weep. She formerly wrote a weekly newsletter for the New York Times, which focused on faith in public discourse and private life. And her articles and essays have appeared in Christianity Today, Comment Magazine, The Point Magazine, Religious News Service, and elsewhere. She's also got a new book that's coming out in May, and the title is, this is such a great title, What Grows in Weary Lands on Christian Resilience. So that's something to look forward to. You can check out, she's done a talk at the Wade Center for us. The talk was titled, Waiting on the Slow Work of God, How the Habit of Hope Transforms Us. And that, Aaron, can we put that in the show notes?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that'll be in the show notes, and you can check that out. She's worked for various churches and Christian nonprofits for over 2 decades, serving as a parish priest, a campus minister, and with those affected by poverty and addiction. She and her husband, Jonathan, have 3 kids. Welcome again, Tish. We're so delighted to have you on the show.
I'm so happy to be here in person at Wheaton.
Yay. So I wanted to start off with by talking about a book that really shaped my thinking, and that was Liturgy of the Ordinary, which many of our listeners might be familiar with. It's got a green cover and an open face peanut butter and jelly sandwich on the cover. But if our listeners aren't familiar with it, and if they're not familiar in particular with liturgy, could you just talk a little bit about liturgy and what it is? I know that's starting very broad.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, with a book called Liturgy of the Ordinary, that's a question you get a lot. So I would say liturgy is just repetitive practices that form us. That's a very broad term. So when we say liturgy, we're typically talking about a way a church structures its services. And that is certainly what liturgy is.
Mm-hmm.
And that looks a lot of different ways. One of the points I make in the book is that whether or not your church says it's liturgical, it is. It has a liturgy. I grew up in a church that would explicitly understand itself as non-liturgical. But if I was sick and stayed at home one Sunday, I could tell you within a few minutes probably what was happening in the service. So it was pretty predictable. We did it, when you do something every week, whatever it is, there tends to be kind of ritual habits, practices that form around that. That is how we kind of think about church on Sunday. What I do in the book is take that idea of the practices that we repetitively do that form us over time, and I apply that to the rest of the week as well. And not just applying it to the rest of the week, although that's part of it. I mean, I look at practices we do every day, habits we do, things that you don't even think about, things like sitting in traffic that form you in time. But I try to make links between those things and gathered liturgies on Sunday. So it's not so much saying we have a liturgy on Sunday and let's look at the liturgies of the week. It's kind of looking at the cross-training between those, the conversation that's happening between those types of liturgies in our lives.
One of my favorite chapters is when you talk about making the bed. If I can go to Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien for a minute, J.R.R. Tolkien talks about subcreation, right? How an author or a writer can kind of create this whole world and kind of create this ordered existence, really, because Tolkien wants the world to be coherent and ordered. And you talk about making the bed as an act of ordering, which ties us back to a creating God, which I just thought was so great.
Yeah.
And you have other practices as well that you talk about in addition to like being in traffic and making the bed. Can you give us a few other ones that you talk about?
Well, I will say I wrote the book a long time ago, and I make it a habit to never read my books once they're out. So it has been it has been like years since I've read. You've read this book much more
recently than
me. But I do.
I want to hear about why that is.
I talk about it, and I own the book. But so some of the things I talk about are waking up. making the bed, brushing your teeth. I talk about having a fight with my husband, an argument with my husband. I talk about sending email or checking email. I talk about, can't remember all of them. And
it's not like a pop
quiz. I talk about going to sleep. The book follows 24 hours of my life.
Yeah.
So it's it begins with waking and ends with sleeping, and it's actual things I did throughout the day. This is a little behind the scenes. I don't know if all of these activities happened actually in one day, although it's very likely. But they were all things that actually happened. Yeah. So I lose my keys in one of the chapters. That it all happened maybe over the course of maybe 3 weeks. I kind of gathered these things up. But so they were just like normal. It looks like it's like just a totally normal, boring day in my life. There used to be a drama called 24.
Oh, yeah.
Every episode was like 24 hours.
Jack Bauer.
And I say that my book is like if you took 24 and were like, but let's put it on the most boring.
That little clock going in the
regular, ordinary day.
That music.
Just a day. Just a normal day.
Yeah.
That's the book. But I stop in each of those activities and try to unpack kind of what the spiritual significance is at the moment, but not just the spiritual significance, but the formative reality of those moments. That's what gets the liturgy. It's not just, hey, this matters to Jesus, which it does, but what is happening formatively in and through our daily life.
And now I'm always going to think about that book in terms of 24.
It's the anti-24.
The anti-24. That's great. C.S. Lewis, he writes about liturgy, and he writes about it in his book, Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. And his comments are really interesting. And I wondered if I could get your take on them.
Yes, I know what you're going to. I'm not just saying this because I'm a huge Lewis fan. I've read a ton, and I love Letters to Malcolm. It's not my favorite Lewis book, but it's in the top 5, and I don't think it gets enough.
It doesn't.
Love.
Yeah. Aaron, you've done some work with that.
So good.
I have, yeah. There's actually some unpublished chapters from Letters to Malcolm at the Wade Center. There was going to be a different ending to the book. He changed the ending to the book, and there was a whole section where he talked about the parable of the unjust steward in Luke chapter 17 that got cut out of the book. Yeah, interesting stuff. Yeah. Come to the Wade Center.
I want to know why he changed it. Okay,
you have to come to the Wade.
Yeah,
that's so interesting.
Yeah, but I like that book a lot because he does actually grapple with his sort of regular Anglican faith and talks about prayer and liturgy and different ways of praying and stuff like that. So yeah, sorry, Jim, ask your question.
So here's what he says. He says, my whole liturgiological position really boils down to an entreaty for permanence and uniformity. I can make do with almost any kind of service whatever if it will only stay put. So on the one hand, he's calling for permanence. But then on the other hand, he says, as to the words of the service, liturgy in the narrower sense, the question is rather different. If you have a vernacular liturgy, you must have a changing liturgy. And he says it should change slowly. He says one word every century or something like that. But so there's this tension between permanence and change. I wonder if you might respond to that tension. Where do you fit in terms of that tension? Do you like things staying put or kind of changing a lot? Or what do you think about that?
Man, that is such a great question. I have been asked literally thousands of questions about liturgy, the ordinary, and I don't think I've ever been asked that question. So I'm going to just sort of think aloud with you. But I think that changes for me. It would be hard for me to say I am for one word a century, or I am for 80%. I'm 80% permanence, 20% change. I think there have been seasons in my life where that's changed. I think as I've aged, my views on this have changed. I also think, I grew up Southern Baptist. I was Presbyterian for a little while, and then ended up, I'm an Anglican priest now. Have been in the Anglican Church for decades now. And as I experience more of the liturgy year in and year out, I think my relationship to it has changed. In some ways, it's I'm so much more appreciative of it. I'm so much more concerned that we don't change it in kind of a willy-nilly or casual fashion. On the other hand, I also I am not enamored of it in the way that you are when you first become, well, when many people first become an Anglican.
Yeah.
I'm less fussy about it. I've seen the liturgy go horribly wrong and things fall apart and Jesus glorified. And I've seen folks that are obsessed with, the exact right chalice. What chalice should we use and what material should it be made of? And that seem to miss the gospel. At the same time, I think there's a current in evangelicalism that is always for innovation, always for changing things up. And I think that is detrimental to the spiritual life. I think it's not just neutral. I think that actually exhausts us, and it both exhausts the participants in that sort of ever-changing liturgy, and it exalts the notion of creativity and human ingenuity and being the big show on Sunday too much. It exalts the leadership in some ways too much. I mean, I kind of love that I can fall down dead in the middle of a service and they could just keep going. I mean, they know what to do. They don't need me. So I think, all virtues have two vices associated with them, right? That something like courage, on one hand, you can have cowardice, but on the other hand, you can have foolhardiness, like running it. And all of them are like that. You can have pride, you can have too much pride, arrogance, right? Or I guess the humility would be the virtue. Pride is too much, and then pusillanimity is not enough. And so there's, I think in the same way with this, there is a tension between kind of being, I know a friend who knows an Eastern Orthodox priest, and he turned to his friend and he said, above all, we do not innovate. And he was just like, we don't innovate. And part of me is like, I'm not sure that's a good in and of itself, but also I just don't think it's true. I don't think it can be true, particularly if it's in English, which is not always in an Orthodox. But if you change language, goodness, that changes everything. But also things that I think we don't think about how they affect us that profoundly shape and form our churches, like air conditioning, electric lights, having sound projected. All of these things massively change the way that, it really changes our experience of worship. It's an innovation. Taking a car to church versus walking there, that is clearly an innovation in the way. So I don't buy it. I just don't think non-innovation is possible. At the same time, saying, the evangelical impulse of always changing things up, or even I think the American impulse of really just being anti-tradition in a lot of ways, I think that's really, really harmful. And so I think I land a little bit like Lewis in that I think what we need is something like, to use Benedictine terms, we need both stability and conversion of life. We need the steadfastness of stability, but we always need to be open to the Spirit transforming and renewing things. And so I think that looks like holding to the past, but innovating within the context of a tradition, of a community, and of grappling with the scriptures over time, and grappling with one's culture over time. I do think, obviously, culture plays a part in innovation. When we talk about language, that's a cultural artifact.
So another one of the books you've written is Prayer in the Night. And it's just been so encouraging to so many people. Thank you so much for writing that. And this one is organized. When you said that your Liturgy of the Ordinary is organized starting in the daytime and going to night, this is the reverse of that. So it starts in the night, and by the end of the book, we arrive at dawn. And this is a book all about suffering. So it's kind of this mirror image. I just love the organization of that.
I love that you picked up on that. I think you might be the only person who has mentioned that and picked up on that. But
All right. Got bonus points.
I can tell that you're, an English professor guy.
Yeah.
Like
I love the structure of it.
Think about these details that are. Yes, I love that too.
I also want to say I love the last part of the book. You have a little quote from David Wilcox, who's got a song called "Show the Way," which I've long thought was one of my favorite songs. So our listeners should go listen to David Wilcox's song "Show the Way." It's really good.
Just put it in the. Can you in the podcast with it?
I can, yeah. At this point, we've got John Guerra, David Wilcox, and then your YouTube thing. So yeah, check the notes for those.
Let's just make a soundtrack. Let's just make a Spotify.
Oh, I'll
list.
put together a playlist. Yeah.
Playlist for this episode. Fantastic.
One of the things I wanted to do is put. This is getting a far field, but there's so many songs mentioned in Prayer in the Night.
Yeah,
and there's so many actual songs quoted in it, and all over the place. I quote Fugazi and I quote Julie Miller. I mean, it's a huge.
Yeah.
But then there's also lots of songs that aren't directly quoted, but are part of it. Like Your Labor is Not in Vain, Wendell Kimbrough's song is very much like was playing as I wrote it, and the whole chapter on work is really infused with that song. So I wanted to do a Prayer in the Night playlist.
Oh my goodness, be amazing.
Now it feels maybe it's not too late. I don't know. Maybe this podcast will kick off. But I wanted to do it, and then, but I had a baby as I was literally turned in the last revision from the labor and delivery floor of a hospital.
Oh wow.
So I got busy, and then 2020 happened. I don't know if anyone remembers that year.
Yeah.
But it was COVID. And I just didn't ever have capacity. And by the time I had capacity, it felt too late. So I never did it. But it's not too late.
There's an opportunity there.
You could put together a
Aaron.
Prayer in the Night playlist.
Yeah, Prayer in the Night playlist. This is in the show notes.
No pressure, right? Oh, no.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about this book? What was your motivation for writing it? So I'll just say for our readers, it starts with nightfall, kind of the dark night of the soul, and moves through kind of tracing the way of the vulnerable, and then it gives us a kind of taxonomy of the vulnerable, and it ends with dawn, and it's all organized around the prayer compline. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you'd talk a little bit about why you wanted to write this book and what it's about.
Yeah, I didn't want to write this book. That was
at
the beginning. I didn't. I was going to write another book. It was very theological. It was about the creed, which would be a great book to write. I hope maybe someday. But I was setting out to write this other book, and it really the idea of this book kind of dropped into my brain, which was the idea was to approach the idea of suffering, but very specifically the question of theodicy. How can God be all powerful and good, all good, and regular, like bad things regularly happen in the world? That question, which is a philosophical question, but I think, and I make the argument in the book, is more profoundly like a primal cry. It feels like it's more than philosophical. It's this thing that we wrestle with on a deep, deep level. It's an existential kind of question. And I wanted to write about that, but I didn't want the book to be memoir. I felt like I honestly, and this is somewhat of the book is pushing against about what I'm going to say, but I'm just being honest. I felt like I hadn't suffered enough to write that book. I felt like the people that write that book are people who have had children who die or who have faced, terminal cancer, and I hadn't. And so it felt like, and I didn't want it to be memoir led. But I was praying Compline, nightly at the time. I don't. Unfortunately, sorry to disappoint readers, I don't pray it every night now. But I was at the time and had for a long time, years, at that point. And so the notion of framing the book around this particular prayer, keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night, and give your angels charge over those who sleep. I won't say the whole prayer, but it's a specific prayer in Compline. The idea of framing it around that one prayer came to me. And a lot of times it's the structure of the book that draws me into writing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that that came to me literally when I was writing a different book, or I wasn't writing a different book, but I had gone on a writing retreat to try to write this other book and start it. And this book, with this idea of prayer in the night, it was like a cat that followed me home and would not leave me alone. It was like when I prayed, when I thought, it was just, this is the book. It was just sort of tap it, or like, I guess cats don't tap their foot, but it did feel like someone just sort of waiting, just staring at me, waiting. And I was scared to write it. I didn't want to write it because the book tells a lot of my own story, specifically of the year of 2017, when my father passed away at the beginning of the year, and then I had 2 miscarriages. One really traumatic, medically emergent. There was an emergency of I hemorrhaged, and the other was a second trimester miscarriage, so a later miscarriage. And we moved across the country. It was a hard year. It wasn't a facing the worst tragedy of your life kind of book, in the sense of it wasn't a book about having terminal cancer. Those books are really good and important, but in some sense, it was a really hard year, but it was a very averagely hard year, in the sense that a lot of people move and face loneliness. All of us, if we live long enough, will lose our parents. And miscarriages, unfortunately, I think it's 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 pregnancies. It's very, very common. So, but what I found is just something being common does not make it less painful. And that year kind of piled up together in a way that made it where the theodicy question was real big. But by the time I set out to write this, I was moving out of that a little bit. I was done with that year. And so I had this big sense of, I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to write about that. I don't want to have to sit in that longer. That was one thing. The second thing was, I thought, I haven't suffered enough. I can't write a book on suffering. I'll feel stupid. Like, it could be so much worse, right? And which I felt from the Lord, it felt like, well, that's exactly why you should write. I mean, that's because you think suffering is this thing that only belongs to certain people, that only belongs to people with a certain kind of really, really bad story. Yeah. When in reality, suffering is something every one of us faces. And if none of us feel permission to name it a suffering and to wrestle with God in our common sufferings, then we'll all reserve suffering to be this abstract thing outside of us for just a group of people. And then the last thing was, I thought, if I write this book, everyone's going to come and tell me the worst thing that ever happened to them, and it's going to destroy my faith. Like I just thought, I can't. It'll break me. And but I couldn't give up this idea. It really demanded to be written. It was. I know writers talk about that, and I certainly haven't had that experience with everything I've written, but it was this book that I just couldn't. And what I realized, what I think was happening, looking back and as I was writing it, is that I was using this creedal theology heady book to avoid what was the real question of my life. And the real question of my life was, how do you trust a God that lets bad things happen? Mm-hmm. And it felt like I was using all kinds of theology to try to avoid the central question of my life, which was that. And I write that question in the first or second, I think it's the second chapter of the book. I say, I talk about how we can't trust God to keep bad things from happening to us, to keep all bad things from happening to us. And I wrote, so if we can't trust God to keep bad things from happening to us, how do we trust God at all? Mm-hmm. And when I write, I pretty much write every day. And when I wrote that book, I mean, when I wrote that sentence, I didn't have any, I had nothing else to say. I didn't have a next sentence
It's just a
because
question.
I
Just a
didn't
question.
know the answer. And I walked away. I didn't write for like a week, 10 days, something like that, maybe 2 weeks, because I was like, I don't have the rest of the book. It's a problem because it's the second chapter.
And you didn't want to just start making it up.
And so it took me writing 80,000 words,
Wow.
which the book is way shorter than that, but
Yeah.
and editing them down. I mean, I just had to pour out this deep distrust of God and wrestle through it. And I mean, this is why I write books. For me to believe the gospel, I have to write 80,000 words and edit it down to 40,000 over 2 years to be like, okay, I kind of have an answer to that question now.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. I didn't want to write it, and I was using other things to avoid the central question of my life, and God just kept making me deal with stuff the way God does. Super annoying.
Writing is processing.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's so much there to unpack. One thing is, talking about suffering, talking about hard things is hard to do. How can we do a better job in the church of talking about suffering and issues of suffering? What did you discover by writing this book about that question?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think part of that is being willing to name suffering, talk about suffering openly, and that has to sort of start with leadership setting a culture where you can do that, usually by talking about their own suffering and struggle, but then also really leaving space for grief. I think that the church sometimes does a disservice to people by rushing so quickly to the kind of correct theological answer of, we trust God in the midst of it, or Jesus, calls us to a cross, and which is all true. That's all true. But someone who's reviewing my book talked about how we tend to, the word he used was cork grief with theology. And I think that's a really helpful image, is that we never, ever ought to use theology to cork grief. You just don't see it in Scripture. Lament is such a huge part of the Scriptures, and grief is such a huge part of the Scriptures. I mean, the fact that Jesus wept, knowing, he had better theology, he knew redemption was coming in a way we didn't, we can't. And yet he grieved. And so I think leaving space for grief, not policing people's grief, telling people, okay, well, you've been sad about this long enough. It's time to move on.
Yeah.
And then actually practicing lament. I think leaving space for services of lament that we do together. Reading the Psalms is really helpful. So those are some ways.
Yeah. It strikes me that C.S. Lewis serves us well here, too. Sometimes I have my students read bits of The Problem of Pain alongside A Grief Observed. And those are very different books, and kind of get at what you're talking about a bit.
Yeah. It was interesting. I looked at both in writing Prayer in the Night, but I think I only quoted, I might have quoted Problem of Pain, I can't remember, but I quoted Grief Observed way more, because it's a man that's been through something. He's processing.
Yeah, he's processing it. Yeah. Yeah, David Downing, the former co-director, his theory is that, again, to come back to Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer, that was actually Lewis processing what happened with losing joy. So the initial Grief Observed is just sort of the raw in the moment. He's trying to help people, and it's not necessarily him being autobiographical as much as it is him actually sort of putting this character into to give other people a space to grieve. But yeah, I think Letters to Malcolm, I feel like you should read that after you read Grief Observed, because you do actually see some of those things carried forward where he does sort of actually wrestle with all that. Can I ask you a question about Compline? Why? I know obviously that's a thing Anglicans pray. How did that help you into that suffering framework. I know for me personally, when we pray compline in our home group, it always helps recenter me and makes me focus on other people, sort of, so I keep watch over, and then we go through and we list all these other groups, and I start thinking about, oh, wow, yeah, all these people that are, we're here doing this, but somebody's in the hospital, somebody's working, kind of a thing. How did that help you sort of as a framework in talking about suffering?
Yeah. Well, part of it is compline. There's two things. One is I found myself in the midst of suffering in 2017 when all this was going on with grieving my dad and dealing with my own, the fallout of my own body, physical body through miscarriage and pregnancy loss and all of that, nighttime was particularly difficult. I felt like in the day I could stay busy. I had little kids. I had a job, and it was the quiet of night that I almost started to feel anxious. Lewis talks about this. I didn't know how much grief felt like fear, that there was something that, that probably isn't an exact quote as a paraphrase. Sorry. It's intimidating talking to Lewis experts.
You're all good.
But where when the day would start to slow, there's a panic of, I'm going to have to face vulnerability. I'm going to have to face emotions for these nighttime hours. Something about, and so that was true in my own life, but there was something that drew me about the imagery of that, the starkness of night, the vulnerability that all of us feel at night, that I think is really reflected in compline. I mean, Christians began to pray a night office, 2nd century, very, very early. Of course, it wasn't exactly like compline, but the idea of keeping vigil was real early. And they would pray, sometimes rise at midnight and pray, or midnight, sometime in the middle of the night. And the prayers they would pray are really recognizing vulnerability in that. And so you feel that in the practice. And think about people praying this in the 3rd and 4th and 12th century, so many centuries where there wasn't electric light, there wasn't 911. There wasn't. So nighttime was is just human wide, the symbol of vulnerability.
Oh, yeah.
And that as a writer, as an artist, that really drew me. The notion of darkness really drew me. My own biography of struggling at night, but then also compline became the way I could pray. I talk in the book about, in the midst of these questions of theodicy, really struggling to pray, which is hard because I was a priest at a church at the time. It was my literal job to pray. And, but it felt like I just don't have the words. It's too big. There's too many questions. There's too much mystery. I don't know how to talk to you. I don't know how to do this. And it felt like compline was this way the historic church was like, we got you. Like we're holding you, we have you, we see you.
Yeah.
And there's so much in the prayers themselves that acknowledge vulnerability. I just really had a hard time at the time taking any advice, really receiving from anyone that the Christian faith felt too peppy and perky. Like I just couldn't do it. It just felt like false to me in a way, particularly at that time because I was in grief. And I needed something that acknowledged God and the power of God and the goodness of God and sovereignty of God, but that also said, we're going to die. This is going to be hard. Like things aren't going to work out the way you'd hoped, that held the tension of that.
Yeah.
And these prayers in compline really do. There's, things like guard us waking and guard us sleeping and guide us waking, that awake we may watch with Christ, and asleep we may rest in peace. Rest in peace. That's literally what we say when people die.
Yeah.
And keep us from all snares and dangers of this night. It's this acknowledgement that there are snares and dangers in the night. And so almost every prayer calls on God, but from this place of acknowledging death and darkness. And I just needed that. It was like I needed something that let me hold all that together. And that it did. The prayers of Compline did.
Yeah. Can I ask then how that led you into the book that's going to come out in May?
Yes. It's been hard for me to wrestle with, because the next book is also, I kind of start in like a hard time of prayer.
Uh-huh.
So I feel like everyone's going to be like, Tish never really enjoys prayer. I will say there were, so I wrote Prayer in the Night 2018, 2019. And this last book, I just finished, so it's 2025. So what is that? Like 7 years between. So there were some good times in between those 7 years. There were also some hard times. I worked for the New York Times for a few years, and I didn't write a book during that. I wrote a book on Advent in the middle. So there's been some time that's passed. I do think, though, so my new book starts with a place of burnout, which is different than deep suffering. I actually make that distinction in the book.
Yeah.
It wasn't a place of deep suffering. It was actually, that's part of, I think, the disorientation of it is that you think, well, there's nothing happening in my life that should make me as exhausted as I feel. But I have talked to just multiple people. This isn't really even in this book, but that getting through suffering is difficult. And then when you get to the other side of it, the suffering, the acuteness of the situation is over, but you're just worn out. You're just tired. And so the book deals a lot with the question, or with the verse where Paul says, do not grow weary in well-doing. Do not grow weary in doing good. Because if you do not give up, you will reap a harvest, right? So, but what about when you are weary in well-doing?
Yeah.
What do you do? And so I hope that people don't say, oh man, Tish just writes books that are kind of bummers. It is a different temperature in that this book is way less about night. It's not about night. It's more about that time between noon and 5 p.m.
Yes.
You're tired.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a day in front of you. You're not.
Yeah.
And but I mean that metaphorically. I think the season of your life.
Absolutely.
When you're at about 3:00 and need some coffee. That season, which I think for many of us is kind of, I want to put age. Anyone can read my book of any age, but I think maybe 30 to 60, it feels like that sort of middle you're not,
age, yeah.
That mid stretch.
Yeah.
So it's not about theodicy and suffering like my other book, but I do think that a commonality might be that there is some wrestling with how to pray when you're not feeling it.
Yeah.
But sometimes we don't feel prayer because we are deep grief. Sometimes we don't because we're really worn out and overwhelmed by political polarization and overwhelmed by the needs of our children and our parents and our spouse and our friends. And I think, I guess there are different, I think maybe all of my work to some extent is about prayer and the impediments to prayer. But there's different impediments to prayer.
Yeah.
And this is kind of exploring it.
Definitely. Okay. This is, interesting question. If you have another one, Jim, we can get back to it. But
you go.
One of the theories of burnout is that it's the result of some kind of moral injury related to something that you had hoped to accomplish. And so you work really hard to get something done and you feel like you either can't accomplish it, it's never going to happen, or you get to the end and you feel like it was all sort of wasn't worth it. Where did you sort of see burnout? How did you interpret that? I'll just speak personally. When I in my former career, I was a associate pastor in Southern Baptist churches, and my wife and I went through infertility and realized we couldn't have kids. And that was a very traumatic thing for us, wrestled with a lot of the same questions. And when I left that position and came here to Wheaton, I had about 3 months in between that when I wasn't working. And it was in that moment that I realized I had been in burnout for a long time. And it took me a while to recover from that. And so I asked that because some people tie it to, career, but obviously burnout is a thing that you can go through just in your life in general. Maybe your career is going fine. How did you sort of see that and interpret that, both in your life and then maybe through what you talk about in the book?
Yeah. So I wouldn't say the book is about burnout specifically.
Okay. Yeah.
Although that's part of it.
Okay.
I actually was asked years ago to write a book about burnout and said no, because I thought, I don't know anything about burnout and I don't write business management books. I thought burnout was all kind of, in my mind, I say this in the book, it was like the property of occupational therapists. It was about, it was like something CEOs dealt with. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, I write about like theology and church history and stuff. What does that have to do with me? And then, then I worked for the New York Times, and I got really burnt out, and not just so I was writing about God every week, but my own relationship with God felt like the line had gone dead. It felt like God. I write this in the book, but this is very much how it felt. It felt like God was this corpse on a table that we all debate. And we all argue about evangelical voting patterns and trans people in sports, but there's nothing living here. There's not the Lord of heaven and earth, the one whose glory fills every inch of the universe. There wasn't this mystery. There wasn't a living God.
Yeah.
And so I think there was, I don't know if you would call it spiritual burnout, but there was some spiritual dryness.
Yeah.
And then there was exhaustion. I had young kids. I have a mom with Alzheimer's. I have lots of different needs pulling me in lots of directions.
Yeah.
There was career stuff for me as well. It really affected my motivation for career. It was kind of all of that. But I also think that it's unreasonable to put I think we're one whole person. And so it's really hard to talk about your spiritual life versus your, vocational life versus your home life. I think these bleed into each other. So when you're really struggling at home or with your marriage, that's likely going to affect your spiritual life. That's likely going to affect your work life, vice versa. If you're struggling in work, that's very likely to affect the amount of energy you have for your children. I mean, these are all we're one person.
Yeah.
So I became intrigued. At the same time, all of this stuff was coming out on not just career burnout, but burnout became this concept we talked about. I mean, you look at there's headlines on marital burnout, social media burnout, political burnout.
Yeah.
I was really intrigued by Barna's research on we had higher levels of pastoral and ministry burnout than we've had since forever. So you see all these markers of burnout going way up, and this cultural conversation around burnout. I quote this in the book, but Ezra Klein called it the omnipresent diagnosis of modernity. And so all of a sudden, everyone I know seemed real weary and real exhausted. And I wanted to talk about that from a spiritual perspective. So a few things. I don't call it, I do talk about burnout in the book, but I talk about burnout, I talk about weariness, I talk about this concept of languishing, despondency, and mostly this term from the Desert Fathers and Mothers, aridity, which is a kind of a deep, I think, spiritual, it's the spiritual word for, I don't want to say word for burnout, but the notion of a deep weariness and a sense of distance from God. And basically, I looked in the past several thousand years of church history, and every tradition talks about some form of this.
Yeah.
The Reformed folks talked about drooping spirits. We have the dark night of the soul. We have We have desolation in the Ignatian tradition. It was everywhere, and then of course aridity, which is kind of the through line that's a language the church uses, and all of it names different but similar experiences. And this is the experience that I think it is. It is some kind of void that is not depression, but is also not flourishing. It's something between those, where you do not feel that you are flourishing or thriving, but you are not in clinical depression, and also maybe not in kind of the worst of spiritual depression. It's this middle state, and it is so talked about in the tradition. Prevalent.
Wow.
But not in most modern churches. And so part of my desire of this book is to like say, look at all, it's kind of a storehouse of look at all that has been written about this state that I think we could call languishing now.
Yeah, I like that, languishing, yeah.
Or burnout. That we typically in our culture go to very occupational speak, go to very like therapeutic speak, which is not all bad, but there are theological resources that have talked about this that we're not tapping.
Yeah.
And that's what this book gets into.
Can't wait for that.
I was going to say, now I have to read it.
Yeah. The book is What Grows in Weary Lands on Christian Resilience. It has been such a pleasure to have you with us, Tish Harrison Warren. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. This was fun.
Yeah.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, past collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.